Well, speaking of recruiting, Greg, we wanted to get your thoughts on recent recruiting. We've been covering it a lot, and Penn State is doing pretty good.
Yeah,
There's some key guys that they're looking at right now that we have really been harping on. But have you been following recruiting?
here and there. Like I mean, I follow all the accounts like on Twitter and stuff. I'll never really go on. I might go on a couple of times a year, but like I haven't been on like 24/7 sports or like looked at the official rankings, like unless they're tweeted out. Um, but so I'm aware of like just the different recruits that have signed recently
Mhm.
for sure.
Yeah, so we've talked we John Mitchell, Quentin Martin, a couple key signees,
Yeah,
Belgrave Shorter signed, King Mack, Landon Montgomery. The list goes on and on and on. I think what stands out to me is the fact that they've been getting 4 stars at just
yeah,
about every position, including receiver.
yeah,
And then, Dylan Stewart is a guy, I'm sure you've heard of him, Greg, that I'm really hoping they get. I kind of relate him to Sean Oakman in terms of the excitement of having him sign and
hmm
getting him to Penn State. Uh, is Greg, do you remember anyone in particular when you were in school that was like this huge signing for Penn State? I guess Christian Hackenberg would have been that guy because you guys were both freshmen together, I believe. Um,
yeah.
do you remember a guy that stood out to you that was like this huge sign for Penn State when you were at Penn State? I mean, even Saquon, he wasn't really a
Yeah,
big
no.
sign.
Yeah, he wasn't even really supposed to be like the big running back out of that class. Yeah.
Right.
The one guy that I remember that there was a lot of buzz around, and then there was a complete 180 at one point was Brandon Wimbush. Ultimately signing at Notre Dame. I think that was his first stop. But I remember it was a big deal when he committed, and then the day he decommitted, I remember because the news broke just as we were about to go into a team meeting. So everybody was in the locker room. We go into the team meeting, and like you can tell, like the coaches are kind of scrambling.
Hmm.
So I remember that being a big deal when he committed, decommitted, all that stuff. Um, kind of same deal with Micah Parsons. Ultimately committing, decommitting, then committing again, which worked out in our favor.
Yeah.
Um, but to be honest with you, like as a player, you don't really focus too much on recruits unless it's like an obvious like, hey, this guy's 5 star like quarterback, like going to be a big time player. You don't really focus on it too much. Because at the end of the day, you still need to prove it on the field. Like I've seen guys, 5 star guys, supposed to be all world come in really never play at Penn State. And I've seen walk-ons become captains. I've seen, like I think Saquon, there's a million different, websites and scouting sources out there. I think Saquon was like a 3, maybe 4 star in
Hmm.
um some sites. So like again, he wasn't even supposed to be like the running back coming out of that class. I remember Andre Robinson was way higher recruit or highly rated than him. Um, so like, as a team, like you just see too many, inconsistencies with the stars and the ratings to be too excited about anybody until they really prove it. But I do remember just a lot of buzz around Brandon Wimbush when he committed and decommitted and everything like that.
Well, just looking at you and Hackenberg were freshmen together, right, Greg?
Yeah, yeah. So we actually shared a lot of the same classes. I remember when I was enrolling in my first summer um, at Penn State, our academic advisor Todd Kolka, who's still there now, he's been there forever. I remember talking to him, as a senior in high school. He was like, "Hey, I'm gonna make sure, like, I'm gonna throw you a bone and just give you all the same classes as Christian Hackenberg, like, so you guys have a good relationship." I'm like, "Oh, cool, like that's awesome." So it was me, Hack, and Deshaun Hamilton. It's kind of the that kind of group that was together. So I was with Christian, and we formed a solid relationship really
Yeah.
from one of the first days in classes. um, all the way through his time.
It was you, Hackenberg, Deshaun, Adam Brenneman, Brendan
Yeah,
Mahone was a 4-star guy, Andrew Nelson was a 3-star. Um, Garrett Sickles was a 4-star signee, so they did pretty good that year in terms of
yeah.
signs. But yeah, is there anybody in particular right now, recruiting wise, that sticks out to you that you're watching or that you have noticed, or is that just something that
So
you don't really watch too closely?
yeah, I mean, I don't watch it too closely normally because, like I said, I've seen so many guys like so much variance on ratings and actual performance. But I will say I am excited about Quinn Martin.
Yeah.
So he's a guy. So I help coach our local middle school team, and our last game years ago. This was probably, I don't know, 3 years ago, like, or three football seasons ago, where we had a random game out in Bell Vernon, which is like an hour and a half away from us. It's like, why are they making middle school kids drive an hour and a half for a middle school game? But again, neither here nor there. So we went to Bell Vernon thinking, because we didn't have any film on them, thinking like, oh, it's Bell Vernon, like 6A school versus whatever they are, two A school, like we should be fine. And they absolutely killed us because there was this number 25 running back that was just so fast, like just bigger than all our kids. And like, 3 years later, he's this 5-star kid, like committing to Penn State. So it kind of makes sense now looking back at like, oh, like that makes sense. He was a 5-star recruit, but like I remember watching him like doing things, and I know he's like considered DB athlete. I'm not sure exactly if they said like where he's gonna be playing at Penn State, but like he had the ball pretty much every single time when you know during that middle school game, and he was electric. And again, not the best competition maybe, but like some of the things that I saw him do like as a younger kid, and it kind of reminded me of when I was back in high school. My senior year, we played Woodland Hills for the Whippy Championship, and there was this kid who was, I think at the time he was 24, the running back, and he was just gashing the defense. And turns out it was Miles Sanders, and it was at the time he was a freshman. And it was like, this kid's legit. Like he's gonna be something. Like you just knew from watching him. And it was kind of the same thing with this Quentin Martin kid, where like
Yeah.
anytime he touched the ball, it was going to be a big play. So I'm excited for him for sure.
That's crazy you coached against him. Wow.
Yeah, yeah, and I had no clue who he was until like it comes out like maybe a year ago. Like, oh, this kid's like somewhat local 5-star, and then he commits to Penn State. I'm like, cool, not bad.
At that point, you said that explains it. That explains
Yeah.
Yeah,
why he annihilated
yeah,
us. Got it.
yeah,
Now I understand. I always often say that to people because sometimes whatever you hear these stories about parents asking coaches, well, like, hey, do you think my son or my daughter could be an elite athlete in this sport? And sometimes it's just again, it's not the parent's scope of practice or whatever to be able to know, but if the answer to that question is yes, you almost don't have to ask the question
Mm-hmm.
because you can just
yeah,
see it. It's like
Mm-hmm.
it's just a different level of
yeah,
performance compared to the field. And yeah, Quentin Martin, I know Mark and I were super excited about that commitment. We had just talked about him the show or two before his
yeah,
commitment, talking about how big of a deal that could potentially be and how great he looks on film. I do think he's probably going to get a long look at running back. The only thing that I think might shift him from that position is if he comes in early enrollee, hits
yeah.
hits the winter conditioning, and he just like blows up.
Yeah, he's got the frame for it.
Yeah, if his body blows up and turns into something,
Yeah,
maybe that could be more valuable elsewhere besides running back. But I think he's going to get a long look there, and I do think he's just dynamic, very elite athlete.
yeah. No, I'm with you. I'm with you, but I try not to get my hopes too high or low because like I've said, like I've seen high school tapes, I've seen high school ratings be very different than college performance. So
Yeah.
that's one guy that like I said stood out to me, kind of reminded me of a Miles Sanders type. But you definitely got to temper your expectations of for 18-year-old kids or in his stage 16 or 17-year-old kids, you know.
And one other thing too, you brought up Brandon Wimbush being a big time recruit that Penn State was um, in on and then missed on, and fortunately for those that obviously watched and kind of saw his career pan out, didn't really hurt Penn State too much
No.
in
Yeah.
that regard, which was good. But to your point, very highly rated guy, all the hype in the world, very athletic, didn't necessarily pan out as well as we all would have thought.
Yeah.
And
Austin,
I think
go ahead. Sorry.
go ahead, Mark. Go ahead.
Well, no, go ahead, Greg. You finish your point.
Um, I was just gonna, based off of my thought on Brandon Wimbush, like there's also a lot, and I think there might be a lot of behind the scenes with recruiting in terms of, verbal commitments, decommitments. Because I remember like being a player and like there was guys tied to Penn State and then not tied to Penn State. Like I remember going through this list of guys that had committed or verbally committed and decommitted. Like we had guys, Brandon Wimbush, it was, I believe, five-star quarterback. Justin Fields, I believe,
Yeah.
was committed to Penn State. I think 4 or 5 star. I think he was a five-star recruit. Um,
Yeah.
I believe Will Fuller,
Hmm.
back in the day, was another like 4-star receiver that Notre Dame got. And DeAndre Swift was another guy that was tied to Penn State. I don't know if he committed. So I remember like going through like, hey, what could have been, like, because there were some guys that panned out, didn't pan out, but like just on a short list off the top of my head, and I know there's like a handful of other guys um, that decommitted or there were ties to Penn State, and there weren't anymore. I think Nick Switzer was another one. I don't know if I know he was very close to Penn State and later maybe switched to North Carolina, but it's the recruiting game is crazy now even more so with the transfer portal. But like I said, it's just nothing you can really hang your hat on until they're on the field and they're actually performing.
Yeah. And I can add another name to that list, someone that I've mentioned multiple times, Christian Wilkins, defensive tackle that ultimately
Mm,
signed with Clemson.
Hmm.
That would have been a massive get.
yeah.
That one hurt, as did Justin Fields. That one hurt. Quick follow up, and then we'll shoot over to Mark, so he can get his point in. Are there are there rules and restrictions for current players with as far as interacting with the recruits, Greg?
I'm sure there are. I remember, and there were guys that like could host recruits on official visits and everything. I was never that guy. But like I remember like I don't think you can like reach out to recruits unless they're on a visit, like you can talk to them and stuff, and or like run into them, like accidentally run into them at the facility, whatever. Um, I don't know for sure, but I know they definitely limit player to high school recruit interaction. Now I think what a lot of schools might be doing are like, especially for the bigger recruits, is maybe utilizing or leveraging like the Saquon Barkleys or Micah Parsons, just like, hey, would you reach out to this one recruit we're trying to get, or like just send him like a quick video or whatever it be. But I know like active players like in college, I don't think you can really communicate too much with high school recruits. But like I said, I could be wrong. A lot has changed in the last couple of years, so that might have relaxed a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how that changed with like the whole NIL explosion, which we'll get into briefly to kind of finish things out. but that makes a lot of sense to me. I did kind of figure there were some stipulations because you're pretty much tied to the university and the program being an active player. But yeah, that's a really great point as far as getting former players who
Yeah.
no longer are under the same kind of stringent regulations, we'll say, to kind of reach out on the program's behalf. That's definitely a good way to go about it. It makes a ton of sense.
Yeah. And I think Penn State has a lot of leverage there too, because, you know, Penn State has both Franklin and the university tied together. Whereas like other schools, they might, the coach might have moved, but they might have coached a big time player who's no longer at the university. But so it's like, yeah, like you're the same coach, but it's a different university, different environment. Whereas, with Penn State, like, hey, you have guys like Saquon and Mike and these bigger name guys really giving these testimonies for both. Like, hey, he's a great coach,
Mhm.
he's a great university. So you're getting that whole kind of picture rather than one or the other. Because
Yeah.
like I can't really think of any example, but like if you had a great player at one school, but the coach is no longer there. Like who gets credit for that? Is it the university or is it the coach? I'm sure they both take credit for it, but like there's not as much validity to that. You know what I mean? So there's a lot of a lot more connects with Penn State.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Definitely helps to have about 10 years
Yeah.
of consistency there with same coach, same university. So that message stays consistent. That makes a ton of sense. We'll shoot it over to Mark and get his thoughts on what he was saying earlier.
Yeah, I was just going to well, I was going to say, speaking of guys that could have come to Penn State but didn't, Jim Kelly, Dan Marino, Shady McCoy, Darrell Revis, Tony Dorsett, Larry Fitzgerald. Um, they're
Yeah.
pretty much all Hall of Famers right there that
It,
didn't come to Penn State that could
yeah,
have.
they were all half decent, huh?
Well,
Yeah.
I know Joe didn't like Marino. I think had some character issues at the time, and then
Yeah.
Jim Kelly, he didn't like him either. But you know, we are not Pitt fans on this podcast at all, but Pitt has some really good football players for sure.
Yeah.
The University of Pittsburgh. So, um, but yeah, I know they were all. I'm pretty sure all of those guys, especially Shady McCoy, I believe he really wanted to go to Penn State, and they just didn't.